Good morning. Good morning to our in-person audience, and good morning to those of you who are joining us virtually. I can't think of a more interesting time to talk about digital currencies, the U.S., China, and the world at a crossroads. Let me just say that one of our themes at the Hoover Institution, oh, by the way, I'm Condoleezza Rice, and I'm director of the Hoover Institution. One of our themes at the Hoover Institution is to understand better the technological revolution that we're experiencing in so many parts of our lives. The impact of those technologies, frontier technologies, radical technologies, on policy, on our values, on our national security, in effect on every aspect of our lives. We are also very interested at Hoover in the degree to which the same technologies in the hands of different kinds of political systems can have fundamentally different outcomes. I would point to the fact, for instance, that a technique like facial recognition can help you to get through an airport someday in a democracy, or it can send you to a re-education camp if you are a Uyghur in China. And so these technologies have to be understood, of course, in their context and in the context of the political and social systems in which they are being deployed. I said when I began that this report is extremely timely. It's timely because we are seeing right before our eyes the power of technology in the financial and economic system and its intersection with national security. This report, in calling out the slow pace of the development of US digital currencies against the rapid pace of the development of those same technologies, that same digital currency network in China, could in the future put the United States and the free world at a disadvantage. And so understanding what is actually going on in terms of the digital currency landscape, understanding the implications of what is going on in that digital currency landscape has a real world implication today. One of the panelists here is going to be Stuart Levy, who was the Undersecretary of Treasury when I was Secretary of State. And we were relating in back how we used financial sanctions, first against the North Koreans. Frankly, not too many people cared. And then used them against the Iranian regime. But we're seeing a really kind of grand experiment right now in the use of financial and banking sanctions against a major economy as hopefully deterrence of further Russian activity, but certainly punishment for what the Russians have done thus far. Now, if one were to fast forward a few years into the future, one would wonder whether or not the capacity of the United States, Europe, Japan, and others with major currencies to control the battle space of the financial system would still exist. If this Chinese digital currency network were completely built out in 3, 5, 7 years, what would be the effect of being able to deny dollar-denominated transactions to the now homicidal Russian regime? A lot is at stake here as we think about our long-held expectations that the dollar as the reserve currency for the world would always hold. Perhaps we didn't give enough attention to the technologies that were coming up behind us. And so as you listen to this really very expert panel, and I'm just very grateful to all who are going to participate. It's important to realize that these are not theoretical propositions any longer. This is a real world proposition. And one of the recommendations is that the U.S. government, in all of its aspects, the Fed, the White House, the Treasury, get our act together on digital currencies, because others have made a lot of progress. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Larry Diamond, Senior Fellow, and really the godfather of this project, Larry.
Thank you so much, Condi. I think the real godfather is sitting in a dacha in Sochi somewhere. So with that, let me just say that I have resolved that at any event on international affairs, while what's going on in Ukraine is going on, we should begin by acknowledging that and expressing our thoughts and prayers for the Ukrainian people. And of course, as you noted, Condi, that is not at all irrelevant to the work of this project, since the rise of China's central bank digital currency and of central bank digital currencies in general are going to have profound implications for our ability to enforce sanctions and thereby help to uphold the liberal international order. Condi, thank you so much for your support of this project and for the leadership that you provide to Hoover at this critical juncture in world affairs. This morning, we're going to take a deep dive into our very timely and important report, Digital Currencies, the U.S., China, and the World at a Crossroads. Our program today will present key findings from several chapters of our report through the perspectives of many of the contributors who helped to author those chapters. We will begin our program with an overview of the report by its co-editor, Darrell Duffy. Over the past year, I've gotten to know Darrell well. It's been one of the great joys of my 35 years at Stanford. Darrell has worked tirelessly with his co-editor, our Hoover Senior Fellow, Elizabeth Economy, to recruit and co-chair our distinguished 31-member working group, and to shape our research agenda and to structure and then knit together into a coherent whole the powerful analytical angles and perspectives brought together in this report. Darrell is Adams Distinguished Professor of Management and Professor of Finance at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, a Senior Fellow by courtesy at Hoover, and a leading authority on central bank digital currencies. Darrell, please introduce the report to us.
Thanks so much, Glenn. It's a pleasure to be here. Little did Elizabeth Economy and I know a year ago that when Larry and Glenn Tifford, who's here also, and will speak to you shortly, when they asked us to begin an investigation of the implications of China's central bank digital currency, that we would be here today finding that the implications are more in the present than we had imagined. The report about which you're going to hear this morning reflects a process of scholarship and evidence gathering by a group, as Larry mentioned, of very esteemed scholars and policymakers, former policymakers, and business experts. Many of them are sitting here in the audience today. Others are attending by internet. But I want to especially recognize my co-director and co-editor, Dr. Elizabeth Economy, who has since been appointed the Chief China Advisor to Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, and because of pressing business in Washington, she can't be here with us today. Let me briefly describe how we approach this problem with the benefit of experts in computer science, like Dr. Neha Narula, who heads the Digital Institute at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and has been working with the Fed on basic research on US digital dollars. Stanford computer scientists like Professor Dan Boneh and David Maziris, experts in cryptography and cryptocurrencies. two former undersecretaries of the Treasury, both of which you're going to hear from today, a number of former members of the National Security Council, the former head of the Commodity Futures and Trading Commission, in my opinion, the leading economist on payment systems, Professor Robert Townsend of MIT, the former head of the central bank of the world's largest democracy, India, Professor Raghu Rajan at the University of Chicago, whom you will also hear from today, China experts, whom you're going to hear from shortly, and many, many others. So this is, for me, the most multidisciplinary project I've ever been involved in my career, and brings together, as I mentioned, scholarship and an understanding of how policymaking works, national security issues, and issues involving China. Now, I'm not going to try to summarize our findings right away. I'll come back later this morning and try to give you a summary of what we discovered and what we're recommending to the government. Just let me spend the last minute describing our process. We've been meeting over the past year among ourselves and with outside experts, gathering evidence, reviewing documents, debating, and there's been some serious debates, I can tell you. Not every finding in our report is supported by every member of our working group. We reported the findings and recommendations for which there was a substantial consensus, but not a uniform consensus. So everyone has cover if there's some recommendation that they don't particularly support. The outside experts that whose advice and knowledge we solicited included, for example, Naveed Sultan, who's the former head of global payments for Citibank, the world's largest cross-border payments bank. Gottfried Leibbrandt, the former head of SWIFT, a company that you've been hearing a lot about in the past week. Mu Chongqun, the head of the Digital Currency Institute of the People's Bank of China, who generously shared his time with us, and many others. As we proceeded through our evidence gathering, we began to break up into teams and draft individual chapters. Chapter 1 concerns the state of play internationally, not just in central bank digital currencies, but in digital payment systems generally, including cryptocurrencies like stablecoins. And we discussed the weak current situation in the United States with respect to the efficiency and inclusiveness of our payment system. Chapter 2, why is China doing this? And we're going to hear about that very shortly. Chapter 3, to what extent will China's new technology in central bank digital currencies and other cross-border payment systems be taken up internationally? Chapter 4, what is the impact of that take-up for the global financial order and the security interests in particular of the United States, including the dominance of the US dollar and the ability of the United States to impose sanctions? We're going to hear more about that today. Chapter 5, how can the United States lead in the international community on the setting of principles and standards for cross-border payments and the use of digital currencies? And then Chapter 6, what do we recommend to the US government after all of this is sorted and sifted? So I'm going to come back to you later this morning and talk to you about those recommendations. But I'm going to pass the baton back to Larry.
Daryl, thank you so much. We look forward to hearing more from you. We are now going to launch into the substance of our report, kind of theme by theme. Before we begin, well, I'm going to be introducing several members of our working group and co-authors of this report, panel by panel, but I see at least 3 members of our working group who contributed mightily to this report and who are not on our formal panel, so I do want to acknowledge them. We have Matt Pottinger, who's the former Deputy National Security Advisor to the President of the United States. We have the third former Undersecretary of the Treasury, who's with us today, our colleague, Hoover Senior Fellow John Taylor, and we have Richard Socolow, who was a vital member of our working group. But for now, on this panel, we have two speakers. Professor Zhiguo He is the Fuji Bank and Heller Professor of Finance and Jeuck Faculty Fellow at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. He is a financial economist and an expert on banking and the Chinese economy. Our second speaker will be Glenn Tiffert, who co-chairs with me the Hoover Project on China's Global Sharp Power, which organized and sponsored this research project. Glenn is a research fellow here at Hoover and has edited and co-authored two recent Hoover reports on managing risks from global engagement in our scientific and technological research. So, Zhiguo, you go first.
First of all, thanks, Daryl and Ali, for giving me this opportunity to work on this really interesting project. This is a big fulfillment for me. Just given the short time, let me just make 4 points as straight as possible. First of all, the Chinese CBDC have many different names in the beginning, but in the end, they finalized to called ECNY, E-CNY. ECNY function as a cash, and it's not credit. So in the following sense, households are going to hold ECNY in these special digital wallets, and these digital wallets you can link to the bank accounts. And these banks, commercial banks, will put 100% of a reserve in central bank against the ECNY. So in that sense, at this point, there's no credit created. This two-layer system, we call it a two-layer system, is really try to prevent the economy from cutting off the banks as an intermediary. Okay, and the people should not, as end user, should not perceive any difference between ECNY and those like existing digital payment app like Alipay or Tenpay. So in short, that really Beijing would like to wants the minimal disruption in this CBDC experiment. So that's the first point. The second point is there's a bunch of questions from the audience we collected in advance is that really just about the difference between this ECNY and the blockchain. So ECNY uses the cryptography, but it's wrong on centralized ledger. So it's for efficiency, you know, this is the well known. So it is fundamentally different from decentralization, all these discussions around the Bitcoin. Then brings to the natural question that the ECNY going to feature the so-called managed anonymity that concerns the privacy issue. So what's really trying to do is within the ECNY system, banks, those like operating institutions, they cannot directly see who is paying who and even how much is paid. Only the PBOC, that's the central bank, which has the links between the addresses and the real entity, real identities can trace the entire flow of money. As a result, that you immediately see that the PBOC is exchanging the privacy against the potential compliance for some criminal activities. Obviously, for instance, although the Personal Information Protection Law passed on October 2020 explicitly bans the PBOC from collecting ID information from telecom companies. But in the law, it's allowed that the PBOC, once PBOC see the suspicious accounts activities, then they can resort to the legal forces to obtain the real entity. Okay, so that's the second point regarding the privacy. Third point is that I just want to telling you that even though it's very simple conceptually, right? It's a two-tier system. You have a centralized ledger. ECNY and its implementation are quite challenging technologically. So ECNY was supporting this something called double offline transactions. So two individuals without any internet or telecom connection, you can just tap each other and exchange the ECNY. So it's like literally like a cash. Therefore, that Beijing touts ECNY innovations like these type of features as its edge against Alipay or Tenpay, who still require, telecom or internet connections. This leads to my final point. Some questions coming out in advance is that it's about a cryptocurrency versus blockchain. Beijing never likes cryptocurrencies from the very beginning. It is fascinated by blockchain technologies who thinks that there's a bright future. So Beijing would naturally basically is that ask the private sector to focus on the chain technology itself, but not to touch the currency. There's too much of other socio-economic issues around it. So don't do the currency side. So PBOC developed ECNY, and that's the only legal cryptocurrency, and potentially could be embedded into other blockchain projects. This really partly reflects the planned nature of China, and for sure there are many technological and also economic implications that are lying ahead that we do not know how do we implement and what's the impact. So for now, I will turn my podium to Glenn, who's going to discuss more on economic implications of ECNY. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zhiguo. Many of you will know that China already has the world's most advanced and ubiquitous mobile payments infrastructure through Alipay and Tenpay. So from a certain point of view, the market has already filled that niche, and ECNY is a solution in search of a problem. But that's not thinking like a state. The Chinese state has powerful domestic motivations for adopting the ECNY, and those fall into two broad categories, economic and political. So let me take each in turn. The economic motivations for ECNY are familiar to central bankers anywhere. China's regulators are curbing the excessive market power and data collection practices of the established fintech giants Alipay and Tenpay, which have aggravated systemic risk in the economy and in an economy overflowing with risk. As an alternative, the ECNY will anchor an interoperable digital payment and monetary infrastructure that will not only level the playing field between fintech and traditional banks, but it will also spur innovation by creating new opportunities for other non-traditional players to enter the banking market and offer services. This infrastructure could advance financial inclusion among the underbanked, lower transaction costs in an economy that's facing significant structural headwinds to growth, permit more targeted and efficient transmission of monetary policy, and pave the way for the introduction of smart contracts, which could, controversially, create a more granular approach to capital controls. China's economic statistics are famously unreliable, owing to measurement error, but also powerful bureaucratic incentives for lower officials to juice the numbers that they report to higher officials. The informal economy remains large. There are vast shadow banking and shadow lending sectors that are comparatively opaque to the state. The ECNY could go a long way towards mitigating these problems by making all economic activity directly visible to the national government for policymaking and tax collection purposes. But China's political goals for the ECNY are no less ambitious. Xi Jinping has announced a sweeping plan to digitalize China, partly because he sees big data as a key to more efficient and disciplined governance, but also because he wants China to own a new paradigm of modernity that will cement China's leadership of the future in the public imagination and relegate the US behind as a sort of also-ran, oh-so 20th century power. Policy actors in China are responding to this by touting the ECNY's potential to contribute to a whole range of his objectives on his domestic agenda. Economic risk aside, China's mobile payments giants Alipay and Tencent have grown so large that they were encroaching on the control over capital, technology, and data that helped keep the Chinese Communist Party in power. And they became threats to it, which is why the party has moved so quickly in the last 16 months to cut them down to size. But not without commandeering the powerful new tools that they've pioneered, and that causes some serious causes for concern. Let's focus on data for a minute. The ECNY will generate the largest database of financial information in the world. And in an authoritarian state such as China, that could persist indefinitely, ripe for exploitation and abuse. Although the PBOC insists that it will be a good steward of that data, there are serious reasons to doubt its assurances. It's a weak institution in the Chinese bureaucracy. It is required to respond to the dictates and whims of the Communist Party. And even internally as an organization, it has struggled with malfeasance and corruption within its ranks. But also, ECNY data need never leave the custody of the PBOC for it to feature in social control, because the PBOC is charged with oversight over China's corporate social credit system. Because the ECNY is a near perfect tool of economic surveillance, one question is paramount. Who will watch the watchers? In recent years, Beijing has abused its access to financial and banking information to imprison peaceful critics and shut down non-governmental organizations, for example, charging them with tax evasion or violations of national security for receiving funds from abroad. This is the route that it's pursuing in Hong Kong right now to silence civil society. Recall that ECNY is nothing more than code and data, and we know that the CCP and its surrogates have had remarkable success policing cyberspace, eavesdropping on users, and turning the data that they generate against them. Skeptics should not underestimate Beijing's resolve or its capacity to use the ECNY in exactly the same way. The apex watcher may turn out to be Xi Jinping himself. By degree, she has adroitly established dominion over China's political and economic elites and raised the stakes of competition among them. To the extent that the ECNY makes it easier for him to trace and control their wealth and patronage networks, it may sharpen the despotic qualities of his rule, and it may make potential challengers vulnerable, off balance, and less able to defy his will. Regime type matters, and if Xi Jinping has his way, the ECNY will strengthen China as an innovator and an economic powerhouse, but also as a surveillance state and a dictatorship. And all of that is exploitable. Thank you.
That essentially is an overview of Chapter 2 of our report. I'd now like to open it up to Q&A. I'm going to begin by asking each of you a question, and then if anybody in the audience has a question, raise your hand and we'll get the microphone to you. So Zhiguo, begin with you. Let's talk about timing and pace. How rapidly is the People's Bank of China going to be rolling out this digital yuan? And we speculate in the report about the possibility, maybe likelihood at this point, of China becoming a cashless economy. That is paper money literally disappearing. Is that a realistic prospect? And what time frame are we looking at?
In terms of cashless, I would say that probably 2 years ago, 3 years ago, we already being cashless.
Already there.
Yeah, we're already there. So as I said in my short description, is that in some sense, I used the ECNY when I was last August in China, and it's just literally the same thing. The only thing that I need to do is to download something and check. Down. Then I can tap it. So in that sense, it's the same. But you touch on a very fundamental question that if you read those newspapers, etc., you saw that still China is doing pilot cities experiment. There's a lot of other issues surrounding that. I remember that Mu Changchun mentioned one thing. It's interesting in the sense that a lot of times the payment is two-sided market. So I want to use it, but someone has to accept it. Let's say, if you go to the shopping mall, you need to have some of the device for them to accept my thing. Is this like law can impose these firms or shoppers to install that device? It seems not. If it's not, then I can opt to use these ECNY, but the other side doesn't have the device. So those type of thorny issues are still going on. And the second point is on this Olympics. Seems like everything is smooth, although that I don't see too many of reports on the usage of complaint on this ECNY. So that's kind of a good experiment at this point. Going forward, when do they formally launch? I would guess 1 year to 2 years, definitely less than 5 years.
Okay, Federal Reserve, take note. Glenn, you talked about surveillance. Our report goes into some detail about how this system of central bank digital currency and control and monitoring could link up with China's social credit system. So you could you talk a little bit about the social credit system and how this digital yuan might kind of super empower it?
Sure. So China's social credit system is a largely disorganized jumble of databases operated by government agencies at various levels of government. But there's also a parallel corporate social credit system that exists, which is much more built out and much more unified. And the PBOC has been given the task of rationalizing that. And it governs the ability of firms to do business, to get licenses, to do transfers of income and so forth. And it's meant to be a series of carrots and sticks that ensure that they're complying with all actual laws. And if they're not, or if they're causing trouble or speaking out, politically, the state has tools that it can use to adjust their ability to do business in the market, some of which are opaque. And then the key officers of firms will also have individual social credit files attached to their corporate social credit files too. So if you're a company in China, you've got this. The PBOC will have access to just an immense volume of financial transactions and economic data in which it can actually track how firms are doing business. This is of great interest to foreign firms who are doing business in China because it's a source of economic intelligence that the Chinese state can use against them. But it's also a source of leverage of the state over individual firms and their behavior and the behavior of their key executives. And because all of this data will reside in the PBOC, the argument that the PBOC will be a good, honorable steward of the data is sort of a moot point because it's already all in-house and they wield the stick just because they've got oversight over the corporate social credit system. So they can sort of ensure that firms will align with the interests of the Communist Party and the Chinese state.
Great, and I don't see our computer scientists here with us. Neha Narula was unable to make it, and I don't see Dan Bonet here. But we know that it is often said data is the new oil in the sense of training artificial intelligence. What a gold mine this is going to be for the Chinese neo-totalitarian state. Are there any questions? We have roving microphones and a couple of minutes. Let me go first to my Hoover colleague, John Cochran, and then I'll come to you, sir.
Oh, good, thanks. This was really great. Thanks you for a great overview. I'm delighted to hear that the system is going to be narrow banking, basically, with 100% reserves. That makes sense. When you said, and I wrote down the quote because it's so lovely, all transactions visible to the central government for policy-making purposes, including capital controls, a shiver went down my spine, as I'm sure it went down to everybody else's spine. This strikes me as it's the end for China's digital yuan taking over the rest of the world. Because I certainly don't want the Communist Party of China watching what I transact with. Neither did the truckers in Canada even want the Canadian government watching what they transact with. And I hope we'll get to later, this raises the question, how can we create a digital currency? Sounds like a narrow bank backed 100% by reserves is a great one, but that preserves some measure of privacy to keep our own government from doing the kinds of things that obviously China wants to do. It can strangle anybody, just freeze you out of the ability to buy food if it wants to.
Okay, go ahead. Zhiguo, you understand?
Yeah, so I know that, John, you're a strong supporter for narrow banking. So, somebody listened clearly. So this is I think that there are two reasons. One is this current narrow banking way is just easier to implement. So yesterday we were having a dinner on DM, then obviously introduction of DM expedited the whole process. And if you want to do it quickly, that's the easiest way to do it. So that's one thing. The second one, your question is on this transparency data. At this point, if you push Mu Changchun or any officials, they will say they will, it's the internationalization is something probably it's just up in the air, or they sometimes a denial, sometimes saying that we're working on it, who knows? I think that at this point that it's very clear on this domestic perspective, any imagination or, kind of thinking what could it do on this Hong Kong, et cetera, that will be touched later. I have no clear vision on that. Maybe Glenn has some, you can guess a little bit about direction or later speakers.
Yeah, I don't want to steal anyone's thunder because I think we're going to be getting to the international dimensions of it very soon. But you raise a very important question. That's right. As our group was developing its thinking about this question, particularly those of us who had really deep technological backgrounds, made it clear that there's a wealth of choices that you could adopt in designing and architecting a digital currency and a central bank digital currency. It did not have to turn out this way. This was an intentional set of choices that responded to the type of government that China has. A government that is obsessed with control and obsessed with surveillance and observing its citizens and ensuring that they behave in compliant and a docile way, and then maintaining levers over them in case they don't. And so this central bank digital currency is sort of tailor-made for that set of use cases.
Okay, John, I'm going to re-raise your question on the third panel when we get to Daryl. Sir, go ahead.
Great subject. I do agree data is the future, and I don't want to go backwards, but Facebook had their Libra experiment that never got off the ground. Do you think now, knowing what we know what China was doing, wouldn't it have been fair to let Libra have a go? It was pretty well put together, and it was shut down pretty fast, but now we're looking at more central control of currencies. So, excuse me, my question is, did we shut that experiment down too soon? Thank you.
Either of you want to comment?
Maybe. Maybe it's the stewards.
We have among us the CEO
Yeah.
of the DM Libra
We have a
Association.
CEO of DM. He's the best one to answer your question, apparently.
But there were real debates about whether the right path in the United States is to go with a CBDC or whether it instead should be served by a multiplicity of players in the private market. And that kind of depends upon, to some extent, what your priors are too. Whether you think that the role for government is to provide this, or whether instead it should be left to the market. There are different paths you could take. DM and Libra was one, and the CBDC is another.
But one short answer to you, I just don't think that the way that China is done in terms of technological and the system-wise setup will be accepted here. So, short
Sir, I see that you have a question. Kevin, I see you have a question, but we need to move to the next panel or we're going to fall well behind. So I will come to the two of you on the next panel, and I have a hunch your questions will still be relevant. So can you please join me in thanking Zhiguo He and Glenn Tipper? And now we move to the next panel. I'd like to ask Yaya Fanusi to come up here. And hopefully you will see on the screen. I wish I could see on the screen as well, but I'll have to trust that they're present digitally, virtually. Our first two of the three speakers we're going to have on this second panel on international implications. We're going to be looking at what the prospects are for international adoption and use of China's central bank digital currency, what the prospects are for forging international cooperation in digital currencies, what the international security implications might be. And thank you so much. We've got some great speakers for this, three members of our working group. Raghuram Rajan is a senior fellow here at Hoover, and the Catherine Dusock Miller Distinguished Service Professor, also at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. As most of you know, he served from 2013 to 2016 as the governor of India's central bank, the Reserve Bank of India. Sigal Mandelker is one of our three former undersecretaries of the Treasury. She was Undersecretary for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence and has also held high-ranking positions in the U.S. Departments of Justice and Homeland Security. Currently, she is a general partner for Ribbit Capital. And finally, Yahya Fanusi was able to be with us in person. He is a senior strategist at the advisory firm Cryptocurrency AML Strategies and an adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security. A former economic and counterterrorism analyst at the CIA, his research focuses on the national security implications of cryptocurrency and blockchain technologies. So we're going to go in that order. Raghu, why don't you start us off?
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me. And let me start by talking a little bit about global cooperation. I want to talk about the multilateral system and what kind of structure we can put together. This is a difficult but important topic, difficult because of the events of the last few days. Now, in the chapter that we wrote, we talked about possible alternatives, that is the dominant techno-nationalist system where, China-like, there's the primacy of the CBDC over other private payment options, and the rules on data sharing and privacy favor state objectives rather than individual rights, as we just heard. There is an alternative, which is the system becomes dominantly a techno-democratic system with the coexistence of public and private payment options. You have all varieties of options there, and the aim of the central bank digital currency is to supplement rather than substitute for private options. There's more possibility of innovation and change, and clearly the rules on data sharing and privacy weigh individual rights within that country more. And of course, you can have shades of each kind of system. It need not be so stark, but more importantly, it is possible for both stark systems to coexist in a seamless multilateral system. That is, we can get the benefits of seamless multilateral payments, provided we can manage the interface at the border well. So the US, for example, will not prevent China from maintaining detailed data on its citizens, while China will not question the US's privacy safeguards. And what is important here is the rules on cross-border use of the CBDC allow for these different systems. There's not that much sort of transfer of the same CBDC across borders, but also we have to pay attention to some of the unwarranted effects of CBDCs, things like currency substitution and risk to financial stability, which the multilateral system will have to address. Now, the rules of this multilateral system are being written even as we speak, so it's extremely important that the US engage. Now, within this system, you can have different degrees of integration, right? You can have the current uncoordinated status quo. One country doesn't ask what another country's monetary arrangements are. You could have a coordination of standards to ensure compatibility and interoperability at the border. You could have the systems linked through designated entities in each area, correspondent banks in each system that have settlement accounts in multiple systems. And then you can have much closer linkage, which is you have multi-currency corridors at every border, the MCBDC that's referred to in the report. There are a variety of other options. For example, every currency, every CBDC could be exchangeable into a common global CBDC, let's call it the global SDR, and exchanged out of that into other currencies. Now, typically more integration will mean more efficiency, but a greater need to agree on the rules and institutions across borders. And importantly, I think technology can provide some acceptable ways to manage the interface, not have the extent of information transfer across borders to be so high as to be a problem for some countries. So, given the issues of recent days, I think it's important to talk about one important issue, the desire for democracies to maintain the power to sanction, to cut undesirable countries and individuals from the multilateral system, or the flip side of it is the desire for techno-national economies to track their citizens and possibly those of client nations across borders. Now, the common element in this is cross-border control of access and use of information. In that sense, it reduces the daylight between techno-democratic and techno-nationalist alternatives. Of course, they have different reasons for doing it and see different degrees of legitimacy for their reasons. The Chinese, for example, may maintain the individual doing payments across borders is an enemy of the state, while the democracies may maintain that she's a legitimate government critic. Disputes in the other direction are also possible. So, given this, the problem to some extent is that any multilateral system will have to build checks and balances into the system that other countries can trust. For example, on sanctioning, it is possible that the only sort of acceptable alternative might be supermajority rules on sanctions. We need to get a supermajority in order to exclude countries from the system. And one problem here is that techno-authoritarian or techno-nationalist systems may be much more willing to limit sanctioning power so long as they have power over their own citizens than techno-democracy. So I see this as an important issue of debate going forward. Finally, let me end with some of the institutional issues. Even though the US may not have a CBDC of its own in the very short run, it should absolutely participate fully in the discussions because the standards are being set. And it must continue research in these areas since there may be technical solutions to some of the design problems that we've talked about. The G7 has come up with a set of principles which could guide the techno-democratic path. It's also important to engage the private sector in shaping these alternatives. Finally, and I will leave this as a question, it's worth thinking about whether a technocratic multilateral organization governing payments can bridge differences between these systems and depoliticize the process. I understand, given the last few days, there is a desire to maintain the advantages the current system affords. Yet, given the very actions that have been taken, many players in the world will be wary of the current system, need to think about the long-run mutual acceptability of a global payment system and how power will be distributed across it if we want the broadest reach of that system. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much, and we now go to Sigal Mandekar.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I wish I was there in person, and I also wanted to thank Daryl and Liz and including me in this terrific year with the amazing thinkers. So I'm going to focus a little bit on looking both inwardly and outwardly. And in this world of U.S.-China global competition. I want to start with a few key facts, which is that we have to start recognizing this isn't just about the ECNY, right? This is about a very long-term plan that China very smartly had put in place to integrate financially all over the world. There's ECNY, which is a technology that will enable it to do that in many other ways. But there are a variety of different data points that it's really important for us to understand and focus on. Number one, and ways again in which China has been able to further its ambitions to integrate strategically and financially all over the world. Number one, in 2015, China was able to convince the IMF to include them, the renminbi, in the composition of official currency reserves. Number two, China has the largest banks in the world today by asset size, and they've made it a strategic priority to increase their foreign presence. So Chinese banks, the number of countries in which they have a presence is going up quite dramatically. The flip side of that is that US banking presence in many places of the world, particularly developing markets, the developing world and emerging markets is going down. Three, they understand how online and mobile can enable rapid scaling, right? So you just look at the Alipay story. As of the time of their planned IPO, they had 1.3 billion users globally. That is a number that is more than every other fintech in the world combined. It's really an extraordinary feat, and that's because they have incredible engineers that know how to develop these financial products and develop them, of course, using the mobile phone, where they also have an extraordinary presence. Then you've got the Belt and Road, where China has made financial integration a key priority. So they're integrating themselves as part of the Belt and Road project. Then you have the fact that they are the biggest lender today in 51 out of 72 of the poorest countries, right? Which has a variety of other implications. So why has this happened? How have they grown so quickly and so extensively? I think it's for a variety of reasons, and some of those for which we have to look inwardly, also in the United States. So if you look at the data, starting in 2012, Western banks, US banks, started this trend of massively de-risking all over the world. The BIS has reported a lot of that data. But if you look at places like Africa, big parts of Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, et cetera, you'll just see this continuing trend, right? Citi just announced a couple of weeks ago that they were getting out of Mexico in retail banking. There are many reasons, I think, why all of that is happening. Part of that is because of a regulatory atmosphere that makes it difficult for many banks to operate in those countries. And so, what are the alternatives for the U.S.? How do we occupy the space that is in many parts of the world absent, and by the way, has been also to our geopolitical disadvantage? We're talking about sanctions. Sanctions don't matter in parts of the world, ultimately, where you have no U.S. financial services presence. They may matter today for Russia, but will they be a continuing tool in the long term? How will that happen if the dollar goes down or if financial technology doesn't expand? Today, we have incredible financial technology companies in the United States. We also have this emerging group of companies and developers and engineers who are working in cryptocurrencies and digital assets, who are really rethinking what our financial rails can look like in the long run. It's no accident. And by the way, consumers are choosing those kinds of products, right? It's no accident that if you look at the top 10 financial apps in your app store, you'll find that the vast majority of those are fintech and or crypto. And so for the US, and so those are the kinds of companies, actually, it's something I think that Secretary Rice alluded to, those are the kinds of companies that we have to decide whether or not we're going to enable them to grow, to compete in parts of the world where we're no longer occupying that space. We also have to understand that just like China has had incredible engineers working on products like ECNY and Alipay, we in the United States have incredible engineers that are working on building out the financial guardrails of the future. And the fundamental question, I think, for us in this country is, are we going to look at those new ways of operating in financial services? Are we going to embrace those? Are we going to see those new ways as an opportunity for the U.S. to really expand the ability to give many people who've been shut out of the global financial system access to great new financial products coming out of a great democracy? Or alternatively, are we just going to continue to look at financial technology from the prism of risk? And these are, again, things that we talked about in the report. I know, the title of all this is that we're at a crossroads. We really are fundamentally at a crossroads. We could either tip one way or tip the other. I personally think this is one of the greatest national security and economic security questions of our time. And all of that means, frankly, that embracing financial technology and embracing these new rails, whether stable coins or digital assets, I think there's a real urgency and imperative to do so, in addition to exploring other forms of digital currencies.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks to the Hoover Institution, thanks to Daryl and to Liz, and for everyone, Larry, for putting this together. Actually, I think this experience of being on this, being a part of this working group was actually one of the few Zoom experiences that I actually looked forward to every couple of weeks or so when we would have our Zoom meetings. I really actually enjoyed them. So I think just in a few minutes, I'd like to maybe put the flesh on the bones for some of what we've talked about, because a lot has already been mentioned, but I'll try to add a little bit to it. Really, when looking at the ECNY, my thought is that if it gains wide adoption, it's likely to enhance CCP state surveillance. We've talked about that. But I want to also talk about some of the ways that financial coercion may be possible in a way that we haven't looked at it. And also to stress that the government's broader fintech and data strategy is supported in this, and that some of that could give China an edge over the United States in the digital economy in the long run. So let's talk a little bit about, again, how this digital authoritarianism is being increased and how it threatens privacy, some of the economic coercion scenarios we can think of, and then the broader fintech strategy. Exactly what is that, and then what does that mean for the long horizon of competition? So based on what we know, as I think our panelists have outlined, the key is that the ECNY is going to be managed by the PBOC, which means that the controllable anonymity that we talk about in our report, why is that different or why is that new? It's different because even in the way that CBDCs are being envisioned, where you have these two tiers, in other contexts outside of China, it's understood that the anti-money laundering analysis can really happen at that second tier. And we see the opposite with the ECNY, that the analysis is going to happen at the central bank. And this is different because, as we've sort of alluded to, right, that wide variety of data at the fingertips of the central bank, that's something that, of financial transaction, personal transactions, that's not something that has existed. And even if an authoritarian government has a lot of sway over the private sector and banks, that data has never been so easily within their grasp. So that is key. So the implications there we understand. And I'll even flag, some of you may have seen a video in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago where they had a reporter in the Olympic Village, and she just got $20 million worth of ECNY. And it was interesting because she had to scan her ID. And again, so we're watching, trying to figure out exactly what the PBOC is going to do. But that right there is a really good example of, even at a small use, that information is likely, or that person's ID and their transaction data is accessible to the bank. So AI and big data analysis are going to be available for the PBOC. But what about the short-term economic impact, which I know we're going to talk about maybe in the next panel, in terms of, a lot of times we're going to talk about sanctions, but I want to actually highlight the opportunity for economic retaliation that we've seen signs of. Last year, some of you may remember that H&M Apparel was a Swedish clothing store that has stores in China, was actually somewhat reprimanded digitally in China. And the store had posted some on its blog, some comments about the Xinjiang region. And then soon, probably after, as this became more apparent to the CCP, H&M had its digital footprint removed from China. If you would go to your Chinese Uber to go to the H&M store in Beijing, destination invalid. If you wanted to go to the e-commerce site to get some H&M apparel, it's not there. So what does this have to do with ECNY? Well, there was no ECNY associated with H&M, but we can imagine, I think, that if foreign companies are coerced to use the ECNY, it would be that much easier for the government to shut off transactions, to basically make those ECNY wallets inoperable, right? That's the understanding that we have. So for foreign companies, there are real risks here, right? You'd be using an instrument that is more vulnerable to being disrupted by the CCP. So I'll sort of end with something that we've talked about, which is the broad data strategy. For the past few years, China has had a national fintech development plan, and it directs data in the country to be collected, analyzed, and leveraged for the digital economy. And one quote we haven't said, which I like from President Xi, is data is a factor of production, right? Some people say data is the new oil. I like to say data is the new electricity, because it's, you know, the idea is that data can power everything. It's part of your industrial or your economic processes. And this fits into, I also focus a lot on blockchain technology. And blockchain technology is something that, I mean, blockchain is a bit of a buzzword, but it should be understood that China is investing in computer science that relates to distributed ledgers. The way to view that is part of the overall strategy to innovate with data, to make data to allow it to be transmitted in a more dynamic way, to broadcast it. Blockchain and ECNY, there's an overlap there. Again, the idea is to increase what you can do with data, to integrate it and to use it for the digital economy. So I'll end by saying that, you know, if we think about international implications, we actually don't know if the ECNY is going to be successful, quote unquote. Maybe the public doesn't use it as much, or maybe, you know, there are issues or problems with its rollout. But that doesn't mean we should take a sigh of relief. We don't know how it's going to look in the next year. But no matter where it goes, a big issue is that the CCP will have several years of data to analyze. This is all for, whether it has to go back to the drawing board, there is data being collected that it can iterate upon, that it can learn about, that it can iterate upon, maybe make a better product. Maybe the ECNY is the 1.0. So this brings us back to where we are, which is we in the US are maybe figuring out what a CBDC is, should we have a CBDC, what the design is. And China has already gone on the process of learning from CBDC transactions so they can improve upon that. So I'll leave us there, and I look forward to our discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you, Yaya. I have some questions for our panelists, but I want to get to your questions. So let me go to you all first. And if any of you who had questions from the last panel that are still relevant, please feel free to raise your hand. Go ahead, sir.
I'm Michael Bordeaux. I'm a visiting fellow here. So my question really, it's really relevant to the last panel, but it probably spills over. So it relates to the case for CBDC in the US and other advanced countries. If we hold constant that the privacy and control issues, which seem to be the main issues here, and I'm not saying that they're really important. If you hold those constant, what's the evidence on the efficiency of the ECNY as satisfying the three functions of money: unit of account, store of value, and medium of exchange? Because that's really the basic case for CBDC. So I'd like to know if anyone could say something about that.
Okay, Raghu, did you hear that question? What's the evidence about the efficiency of the central bank digital currency? And Segal, we'll start with the two of you and come to Yaya if he wants to answer.
Well, I think the experiment has just started, so it's unclear that there will be evidence. I mean, what is true is you save on printing costs, which is a big saving. It's not inconsiderable. But also the hope is you can make many more transactions, microtransactions, smart contracts, all the stuff that is talked about with cryptos can be done with CBDCs as the underlying, with the added benefit that you don't worry about the value. You have a central bank maintaining the value of the fiat currency. underlying the CBDC. So in that sense, I think it's many pluses and not very many minuses, except on the financial stability side, which is a different kettle of fish.
Anything to add or comment on, Zhiguo?
I would just say, we still have to wait and see, right? So, I mean, ECNY is still at the beginning of its experimentation. The efficiency question is a really important one, however, independent of ECNY, because there are many efficiencies that have been brought about and are being brought about through financial technology, like cryptocurrencies, which were just mentioned, like the payment systems in countries like India with UPI and PIX in Brazil. So it's going to continue to be extraordinarily important to understand and develop efficiencies into payments, because again, it goes back to this question for the US, if we're not the best in the world, best in class at building in those efficiencies, I think in the long term, we're going to suffer because people will want other products.
Great.
Can I say a quick
Yes,
thing?
please.
And yeah, so maybe one of the things is we have to think about money differently, because it is not just about money being fast and efficient, but I would say money being smarter. And as was alluded to, the idea of smart contracts, programmability. I think what China is envisioning is a smarter currency and a smarter economy.
Okay, let me call on our visiting scholar and the former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Kevin Hassett.
Hey, Zhiguo, how's it going? Zhiguo and I went through Senate confirmation together, so you never get closer to that.
We did. We survived it.
Yeah, she got thrown out of Elizabeth Warren's office. I did not, as I recall. I have a serious question, something I've been following kind of closely that's related to this, and it's actually better for this panel, is that I don't know how closely folks have been following events in Myanmar, but there's a military, and obviously I'm not an expert on Myanmar, I'm just an economist who follows things that are interesting. And in this case, there's a military coup, there's a democratically elected government, and they go into hiding because there's a military coup. And they announce to everybody in the country that they're going to function on Tether. So basically, you could say, for those who don't know, just think about it as like Bitcoin has kept these guys alive. And normally, once there's a military coup, they take over the financial institutions, and they are actually pretty able to just shut down the opposition. But in this case, there's really a civil war going on a year later, in part because of Tether. And I kind of wonder if we think that what China's up to, like with the Belt and Road and everything, you can watch whether Matt Pottinger starts to nod, is that they want to really help the countries that are in their sphere control the banking system, despite all of this financial innovation, as part of a totalitarian plan for the rest of the world. And if you think that this is kind of a first step in that direction to stop things like, the Myanmar resistance for financial systems that are outside of the control of the central government.
Okay, did you have a question? Yeah, go ahead, just pass the microphone right in front, and then I'll ask our panelists to answer both of these questions.
Thank you. I have a question for Yaya and the group. I'm Rod Beckstrom. I was chairman of the Hoover CSAC Cybersecurity Policy Program, former CEO of ICANN, the Internet Coordination Body, former director of the U.S. National Cybersecurity Center, coordinating cyber affairs across military, intel, and law enforcement. The terrific report, by the way, superb. Studied it for an hour and a half last night. Very impressive. I call it almost pan-sophic. You've really looked at all the different angles of this, which is great. And I think Yaya is hitting on a really important point here. I worked very closely with China, of course, when I ran ICANN, because they're the largest group of internet users on the planet Earth. And we had deep technical collaboration and policy collaboration. And they came to me in 2018 and asked me to share thoughts and help them risk manage the digital yuan project and think about what are the economic risks, what are the technical risks, and how do they address those. Without getting into those, what I encouraged them to do, following on Yaya's remarks, I said, look, you've got to do it. to learn. You're not going to know the pros and cons and trade-offs unless you launch a prototype currency and move it. It's got to be real, but you can put a lot of constraints around it. And when I think about the U.S. situation, my concern, and I have spoken with people at the Fed in different places, is, shouldn't we just get started? So the report, I understand, you've got brilliant people, a lot of different views, and you've got to clear it. But I'd like to get Yaya's take on, is the risk greater for us to wait too long, or is the risk greater for us to jump too fast and trip and stumble? But I just would love to hear the thoughts of the group. Thank you.
You start, and then we'll go to Raghu and Sigal, maybe with Kevin's question. Go ahead.
I don't know, maybe this is not a precise answer, but, it's almost like understanding the risks are great. So you can't wait, right? I mean, we based on what we just sort of outlined, but you also have to get this very right. And I think we also have to understand that in the US, it is more complicated, right? I mean, the conversation you had with Chinese officials, you can have with 2 or 3 officials, and they can take notes and then implement it. And we all know that that's not possible. There's no way the US could move forward that way. There's going to be a bigger social discussion, political discussion. But I think maybe what we could think about is it's probably going to take a few years, several years before we would launch it out. And in that interim, a lot of serious work, work needs to be prioritized and done. So I don't know if I'm sort of wavering, but the idea is we have to understand that there are, big risks if we don't get this right.
Okay, Raghu?
Yeah, just on the most recent question, which is that, look, you can introduce the CBDC, but there is a risk of undermining the private sector. This seems to be the purpose of what China is trying to do. It wants to take over small retail payments from the big two, Alipay and Tencent. But in the US, it would be much more problematic. You want to keep the private sector alive, and you want to see the ways you might impinge on the private sector before you introduce the CBDC, even if you're fully sure of its technology. So I think there's reason to wait and make sure. The earlier point, Kevin has its point, absolutely. I think the central bank digital currency offers you a way of cutting critics off, whether they're domestic or international. And that's why it's very important to have, certainly at the international borders, a separation so that countries can maintain their sovereignty. And this is where one of the unintended consequences of CBDCs, at least as of now, should be explored very carefully, whether you get an e-yuanization of many countries, and therefore effective subordination to the will of the central bank of China.
Sigal?
Yeah, I guess just to address Kevin's point, I can't speak to Tether in Myanmar, but I think if you look at the people who are developing in this space, in the ecosystem of digital assets, et cetera, what you're going to find is that these are really freedom-loving people, right? If you look today, for example, at Ukraine, tens of millions of dollars have been sent in cryptocurrencies, and so to help the Ukrainian, to help the effort in Ukraine, which is really quite remarkable. So of course, different types of digital currencies may be used for a variety of different reasons. But the most compelling one in many parts of the world is freedom. It's having the ability to send remittances home very, very quickly in a country where the authoritarian government has taken over is the predominant force in central banking. I mean, the use of these new technologies and the transparent nature of them, which allows you to see what's illicit and drive and disrupt that illicit activity, while enabling aid to get to people in the world who don't otherwise have access to the dollar, who desperately want it, by the way. That's a really important conversation that we have to have, and a really important context in which we have to, I think it's really paramount to think about these technologies. I'll just tell you on a personal note, my parents are from an area close to Lvov, which has been in the news quite quite frequently. But when they were there, they were hiding underground in the woods. They're Holocaust survivors. And when I first started thinking about the use of these new technologies, that's what I thought about. I thought about all these people who today can't get access, like my parents, right? They desperately needed food, money, and imagine if these technologies had been there for them, hiding in the woods, where they could, with a mobile phone, to the extent that was possible, where they could actually have some ability to get more potatoes, which is all they were eating. So we have to really talk about this in a very, very balanced way. That's not a CBDC conversation per se, but in many respects it is, because we're very lucky in the United States to live in freedom and democracy. That's not really the case in many parts of the world. And there are alternatives that can be extraordinarily helpful and really life-saving for people.
Let me close this panel by asking you, Zhiguo and Yaya and Raghu may have thoughts on this, but wearing the hat that you wore at the Treasury Department and perhaps your previous hats at Justice and Homeland Security, sanctions are just so important to the struggle we are in right now. How much do you worry that that our ability to impose them as a nonviolent tool of international defense and management of our interests will be eroded by China's rollout and potentially international adoption of the digital yuan? And are there things that we could do even before we may have a digital dollar that could preserve our ability to use this tool?
Yeah, I worry about that tremendously. I used to say this all the time when I was at Treasury, right? If we're not financially, if the U.S. isn't financially integrated into a particular country because for many different reasons, then the impact of our sanctions are very low. I mean, it sort of depends on how you build out the program. But I was once in Uganda, and a Ugandan official said to me, "What about these sanctions? You sanction these people, they come out of the bush, they go back into the bush." His point was, like, if we don't even have access to your financial products, the sanction isn't going to do anything to anybody. And that's why the whole piece where we're at this crossroads, right, is so fundamentally important. Because if we don't enable financial technology companies, if we don't ensure that so much of this digital asset crypto economy is growing out of the United States, which will continue to give us a lot of different insights and leverage, and our banks are not operating in those parts of the world, then without a doubt, the economic leverage that we get is going to be severely diminished. It already is.
Raghu, any final words before you go off to your class?
Sure. Just on this, I think the point we were trying to make, and I am trying to make, is to be integrated, the point that Zhiguo just made. You also have to be promising you will not use sanctions easily and at the drop of a hat. Otherwise, people just don't want to be integrated, and they may prefer a techno-authoritarian sort of e-yuan, basically because they say, we don't care what you do within your country, do whatever you want. We will never sanction you. So I think we have to be very careful. We want to draw people in, and therefore the standards by which we implement these sanctions have to be very careful. Certainly what happened recently is warranted, but we have to make sure it's that kind of hurdle that has to be crossed for it to be applied.
I should add, I completely agree with that. I also think we have to recognize that we want to give people access to great products. And that's what China understands, right? I mean, there are many countries in the world where surveillance is simply not as big of a deal to them as it is to us. and they'd much rather get access to lending, et cetera, from the country that'll give it to them. And if it's not the US, the predominant force out there will be China.
I know Raghuram has a class he needs to get to. I want to thank you for joining us. Segal, I want to thank you, but I also want to give the last word on sanctions or anything else to Yahya Fanusi.
The last word on sanctions, and wow, that's quite the thing there. So I guess what I would say is offensive, defensive, or maybe it's responsiveness and initiative. On the responsive side, I think the US has to be there when China is at international bodies saying CBDC standards should look like this, or this is what we're doing with our CBDC. Here, world, go ahead and try this on for size. Let this be the new model. The U.S. needs to be there in responding and saying, well, not so fast. What are you doing? What about privacy? But we see privacy differently. And the messaging to actually point out all of what we've been talking today about privacy. So that's the responsive or the defensive. But the initiative side is getting in the game in a way where these questions about where does this technology go? What are the advancements in programmability? Stablecoins, what do stablecoins look like, and how do those efficiencies manifest in the market? Those are questions that we can only answer if we're taking initiative here domestically to answer them. And I think if we do that, then the future digital economy, we will have more play. But we can't and we can't rest on our laurels.
Great. Well, to Raghuram Rajan, who's needed to get off to his class at the University of Chicago, to Segal Mandalkar, and to Yahya Fanusi, thank you so much for your comments today and your great contributions to the report. And I'd now like to ask Stuart Levy, and yes, please give them a hand. And I'll ask Stuart Levy and Daryl Duffy to come up and join us. And so we move to the action and U.S. Part of our report, the challenges and opportunities for U.S. digital currencies and potentially even for a U.S. central bank digital currency. And all this comes under the simple question of, so what do we do now? I have introduced Daryl Duffy. Stuart Levy served for 7 years as also Undersecretary of Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence during both the Bush and Obama administrations, a rather rare thing in this day and age to spend significant time across administrations of different parties. And then he served for a number of years as the chief legal officer of HSBC Holdings. He has also held senior positions in the U.S. Department of Justice. So Stuart, you're going to go first, and then we'll come to Daryl.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Daryl and Liz, for inviting me to be part of this working group. I wanted to make a few comments about the private sector and how I believe U.S. policymakers should guide and regulate them to advance our interests. And then I also want to make some comments about Russia, Ukraine, and answer your question, Larry, about what we should do about sanctions. So one of the things that we agreed in our report and we've heard discussion about is that we think that the decision about whether the U.S. should issue a digital dollar is something that is a complicated issue and it will take time. And I think Neha was meant to be here to discuss some of that. The problem that we have is that time isn't really on our side. I think we've all heard today about how we need to move forward. We need to act. The good news is, as Segal mentioned, we have a really deep bench of private companies that are ready and eager to innovate in this space. They're ready to get into this space with digital payment systems, the issuance of stablecoins, and so forth. The problem is that at the moment, there is no clear federal regulatory framework for how private actors should get into this space. There's a regulatory gap that the US government has recognized and put out a so-called President's Working Group document in November, where they cataloged all the risks that were there, but they didn't resolve them. Instead, they said we should have Congress pass legislation to deal with this. And then they said, well, in the end, if Congress doesn't act quickly to pass legislation, then we'll consider designating this activity of stablecoins being offered for retail payments under our authority under the so-called Financial Stability Oversight Council, so-called FSOC. You can probably guess that both of those things, legislation or FSOC designation, are things that take a lot of time. And meanwhile, these technologies are not being used by the United States. We're not issuing the CBDC, and the private sector is also not going forward to offer stable coins for retail payments in the United States. I think that's something that is urgent, and the government needs to move forward quickly instead of telling the private sector to wait. That's not to suggest in any way that the government should go easy on this. The risks here are real. The regulators can and should set very high standards that the private sector should be asked to meet, but they should be making clear what those standards are and telling the private sector they can act. Now, this is urgent for the reasons that we've talked about. It's urgent because of the progress that China is making on its ECNY, the standards that are starting to be set internationally and so forth. But frankly, the urgency is also highlighted by the events we've seen in the last few weeks in Russia and Ukraine. And I think I'm going to offer some comments on this, and with respect, I think I'll take a slightly different view here than Raghu took. From my perspective, to use Condi's term, we need to make sure that we control the battle space here. Now, I agree that we need to act with our sanctioning power only when it's justified, and there are times when the United States has acted too quickly and unilaterally, but this is clearly what we're seeing now in real time is the national security imperative of the United States being at the center of the global payment system. Our ability to use sanctions and financial measures is critical to our national security, and we need to make sure that we maintain our leadership in this space. The events of the last few weeks, I think, will also have been observed extremely closely in Beijing, naturally. And one of the things that China has always been frustrated with is the ability of the United States, working either unilaterally or with a so-called coalition of the willing, to impose sanctions outside of the context of the United Nations. The last few weeks will highlight for them and make them even more motivated to create a way to get out from under a US-dominated payment system, to supplant it. And the ECNY is clearly one of the ways that they can start to do that. We need to move forward in this space to make sure that we preserve our primacy. Now, if you look at the features of the ECNY and some of the discussion that we've had earlier, it sort of gives us two sides of the same coin about how we should do that. It's not just saying that we need to act urgently. How should we do that? What sort of regulatory steps should we take, and what sort of regulatory considerations? It's really two sides of the same coin. There's privacy on the one hand, but there's transparency on the other. And transparency is the piece we haven't talked about. But first on privacy, if you just listen to what Yaya said and what Glenn said, it's pretty chilling what the potential is of China's ECNY in terms of a surveillance tool. It's clearly probably already is and has great potential to be a key part of a surveillance state. And of course, we should reject that. We would reject that. And I think, as Yaya said, we should be in international fora explaining why that's the case and how we think it should be done differently. But the choice here is not simply between privacy on the one hand and Chinese-style authoritarian surveillance on the other. There's also a choice that we need to make between anonymity on the one hand and transparency on the other. What's happening now in Russia and Ukraine is a reminder that transparency is just as fundamental to US interests as privacy is. And here again, I am speaking more personally than I am for our working group. But when it comes to countering corruption and implementing sanctions that are so critical to our national security, the transparency that we enjoy in our formal financial system is important. These financial measures derive their power by preventing bad actors from accessing the benefits of the system. Right now it's Russia and the oligarchs that are supporting Putin. They work because in the formal financial system, we scrutinize the transactions. We're required to know who the people are, what the transactions are, what the purpose of those transactions are. If we create an alternative system where the targets of the sanctions, think kleptocrats and oligarchs here, can move value at great amounts without having to reveal their identity, these tools will be undermined. And this is a risk that exists in crypto generally and needs to be addressed if we're going to use cryptocurrencies and digital currencies for a at-scale payment system. Anonymity is a key risk here. If we're going to use these at scale, we need to limit or control that anonymity. We need a certain level of transparency. Now, it's worth noting that the Fed put out a discussion paper in January about what a digital dollar should look like, and they put it out for comment. And in the Fed's discussion paper, they said that there were a number of features, but two of the features that they said is that it should be privacy protected, right? Because that's consistent with US values. But also, it said that it should be identity verified. Identity verified. Now, I think the same thing should apply if it's for the US, if it's gonna be a digital dollar, or it should be something that's required in the private sector. It can be done, and that's something that we should be pushing for. So two quick takeaways from me. One, that the US regulatory community should be moving forward both domestically and internationally to advance the possibility of the private sector acting in this space, and by requiring a good balance between privacy that serves American values and transparency that we need to preserve our national security tools on the other. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Stuart. And now to Daryl.
So I want to get right into this. I kind of tore up my script about all of the lists of recommendations in our report. You can read them, they're in chapter 6. I want to make it really simple. A lot of what has been written about in the press is about central bank digital currency. China has one, the US needs one. It's not that simple. This is not a space race. Who's going to come up with a digital currency first? Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell said over a year ago, it's not about being first, it's about getting it right. And we strongly endorse that in our recommendations. We think that the United States government, acting on its own behalf, needs to move on multiple fronts, both domestically and internationally. And it starts at the White House. We need a plan. The US government needs to set forth a plan for what it's going to do with its future digital economy, how central bank digital currencies, how private digital currencies, and how international principles can be set so as to improve the life of Americans when they need to make payments and when they need to protect their security and their privacy. Dr. Neha Narula, who has headed the digital currency project at MIT, working with the Fed, has often said, as we've been briefing government officials over the past 10 days, it's way too early to make a decision about whether the US should deploy a digital currency. The US does not know enough yet about the costs and benefits. And Fed Chair Powell said the same thing yesterday at the Senate. She has said repeatedly that this is a process of learning and feedback between technology and policy formation. The United States hasn't got, as you may have heard, the technology necessary to know whether a US digital dollar is the best solution. The United States needs to begin that technology development, and through a process of feedback with policy formation, that reinforms the technology development, how do you protect privacy? That technology doesn't exist if you, at the same time, as Stuart just said, want to make sure that your payment system is protecting the legality of payments and it's efficient. How do you promote financial inclusion? This could go wrong if the unbanked households in America are relying on paper money for various reasons, either because the banking system is too expensive, or they don't know how to access it, or they're afraid to access it. Then promoting a digital currency that might drive out paper money is not necessarily going to increase financial inclusion. The technology for doing that needs to be developed. This process of technology development, we strongly believe, should be through private-public partnerships. Richard Sokolow, who's sitting here in the front row, in our meetings last week, introduced us to MITRE Corporation. That's one example of how the United States can implement partnerships with the private sector in order to develop this technology. The Federal Reserve is not a consumer-facing organization. It doesn't want to be put in a position of developing software that Americans will use for purposes of making their daily payments. This is going to have to be developed in the private sector. And it's not simply about a central bank digital currency. There are many other approaches. Stuart has just described the difficulties that the private sector is facing in coming out with digital technology for payments. And part of that is a complex web of state and federal regulation that makes it very difficult for entrepreneurs like Stuart to bring out stablecoins and other private technology methods for promoting efficient payments and inclusive payments. And just this week, the Fed has provided a little bit more guidance in the area of whether they will allow fintech firms to get accounts at the Federal Reserve. Our report strongly recommends that the Fed, under appropriate safeguards and guardrails, allow fintech firms to get Fed accounts so that they can provide competition for banks. Our report says that banks are well positioned already to provide efficient, inclusive payments for Americans. However, they don't have the necessary business incentives to do that. The market for payments is lucrative for banks, and there's no particular reason that the CEO of a large bank should, even with a digital dollar or with stablecoin technology, point its consumers towards methods for making payments that would cannibalize profitable franchises like deposit taking, like credit cards. This is going to take regulation in company with the technology. I'm going to move quickly to the international domain, where again, I'm going to quote Jay Powell. He was asked this week regarding the Ukraine-Russia conflict, what needs to be done. And he quote, underscored the need for congressional action on digital finance, including cryptocurrencies, saying, we have this burgeoning industry which has many parts to it, and there isn't in place the kind of regulatory framework that needs to be there. In our report, we strongly recommend that the United States take a leading role in international discussions regarding cross-border payments, regarding the use of central bank digital currencies. China is already moving ahead. It's taken a leadership position. Mu Changchun and others at the People's Bank of China have been saying what they believe standards should be for international use of central bank digital currencies. The US should step forward and take a leading role. It should lay out principles based on US values, privacy protection, and also protecting the monetary sovereignty of other countries. Our report also says that the United States should support the provision of technology or support for development of technology by other countries that are looking for solutions in this place. Some of the members of our working group, not all, support the standing up of a new international agency for cross-border payments. And our report also recommends that the United States government task the intelligence community with assessing the risks and the opportunities posed by China's central bank digital currency. These risks include surveillance, they include the weaponization of money, and the potential erosion of the dominance of the digital dollar. Now, I've skipped over some of the many very specific and actionable recommendations that you can find in Chapter 6 of our report. Over the past 10 days, some of us have been in Washington briefing government officials on what our report would say when it came out this week. I mentioned our meeting with MITRE Corporation, but we also met that same afternoon with Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell and the cognizant governor of the Fed, Lael Brainerd, regarding our recommendations. And we got very good feedback from them in a lengthy and in-depth meeting. Later that afternoon, we went to the Treasury Department and we visited Undersecretary Nellie Liang, who directed the work in the President's Working Group report on stablecoins that Stuart mentioned a few moments ago. She brought together a large team from Treasury. And again, we got a very receptive, curious group of people who wanted to know more about our recommendations. We also met with the staff of a number of senators and the Senate Banking Committee, and we hope to go back in March when Congress is in session, and we will be meeting with some senators and some members of the House of Representatives to go through the same process of briefing officials on our recommendations and findings. We also met in Washington with senior advisors to the President, members of the National Security Council, other members of the Treasury, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, and others in a cross-government meeting. Thanks to those of you that were able to be there. Thanks, Rich. Thanks, Yaya. Neha is not here. Yeah, Sigal just signed off, or maybe she's listening. She was there. And we had Matt Turpin was there. We had a very good interplay, long, detailed interplay discussion with many, many government officials who are very curious. And it's not surprising. This was, bear in mind, already after Russia had begun its invasion of Ukraine. On the same day, we were to have gone into the White House and met with the same members of the National Security Council, who unfortunately were at that moment briefing the press on the sanctions actions of the United States government. So we're going to have to postpone that meeting to hopefully to a March or a future visit. We met with SEC Chair Gary Gensler on Monday, several of us. So we didn't want to just leave it at writing the report. We want our report to have an impact. This is about policy. Policy, we're trying to share our findings, our discovery with the government, and hopefully some of what we found will be useful to the United States government. So thanks very much.
Yep, thank you, Daryl. So we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. If any of you have questions about where we go from here, or you want to share any thoughts of your own, the floor is open. Maybe I could begin by asking the two of you about a subject I don't think we have adequately addressed, which is the international regulation and rules writing side of this. Perhaps starting with you, Daryl, how do we drill down into this challenge of, that is something that maybe can't wait, because if China bursts ahead in shaping the rules and standards, we could be left kind of holding the bag by the time we figure out exactly what we want to do. So could you each speak a little bit about what is in those spaces and what is in those negotiating rooms?
Yeah, so I'm happy to start, and I'm sure Stuart, he's the expert. He'll have more to say. So from my point of view, it's not clear that when it comes to central bank digital currencies, that the principles being set forth by China are going to be, or at least as they're written, are going to be that much different than the rules being printed by the Western democracies. Mu Changchun has already been public saying that central bank digital currencies should not be used to invade the monetary sovereignty of other countries. That's consistent with US principles. What I'm more concerned about is, well, first of all, will those words be turned into actions by China, and will the United States make sure that that's the case? I'm quite concerned about protecting the monetary sovereignty of other countries and maintaining privacy. The second thing that concerns me is this is not just about central bank digital currencies. Cryptocurrencies have been at the forefront in the past week. You've all been reading, what about the workarounds to sanctions? The Fed is not going to be giving out accounts at the Federal Reserve to people all over the world, in my view, because that would be invading monetary sovereignty. So it's not as though the US dollar, through a central bank digital currency, is going to crowd out other central bank digital currencies and somehow re-anchor the ability of the US to impose sanctions. I think the role of cryptocurrencies is more important. China has, entrepreneurs in China have stood up, or at least they're in the course of getting licenses for a stablecoin for renminbi that would settle in Hong Kong bank accounts and would allow actors who wished to make payments internationally to make them through renminbi stablecoins internationally or other cryptocurrencies. The fact that China doesn't want cryptocurrencies domestically doesn't mean that China or other countries wouldn't be happy to use cryptocurrencies internationally. And it's not a coincidence that just in the last 2 weeks, both Ukraine and Russia have their governments have been promoting the adoption of cryptocurrencies. And many other countries are thinking about, as we've heard today, the use of cryptocurrencies as an alternative payment system. So the guardrails around cross-border payments and digital currencies beyond simply central bank digital currencies need to be laid out. In the United States, as Jay Powell stated in his testimony this week in Congress, well, he put it to Congress, we need a regulatory framework that clarifies what's okay and what's not okay, then allowing entrepreneurs to know what space is available for them.
Stuart?
2 quick points. I agree with everything that Daryl said. One is that in addition to what Daryl said, there's also a process going on, I believe, where China is starting to test the interoperability of the ECNY with other countries. And it's not so much about rules writing as just getting out there and trying to figure out how it works, to quote some of our questioners. So that's something that we need to watch carefully. And then second, in terms of cryptocurrencies and the use of them for sanctions evasion, there's a lot of discussion out there in the public right now where people are saying, I think rightfully, that the anonymity of cryptocurrencies is not going to be a way for Russia to evade all these sanctions. And I think that's probably right for now, because, but one needs to look forward and say, what would the situation be if we had a parallel payment and financial system that was run on these sorts of digital currencies? Not what it's like right now. The reason that Russia can't use the crypto space to evade sanctions, it's twofold. One, most of what they're doing is in the traditional banking system, which has all the controls that I talked about. But secondly, at the moment, cryptocurrencies, in order to use them, one needs to go in and out of fiat currencies. You need to check in and out. There are on-ramps and off-ramps. And that's where we have good controls through regulated exchanges, most of whom are responsible. But think about a world where you don't have to keep going through those on-ramps and off-ramps. Then you end up with a payment system that is potentially outside the scope of our sanctions and financial measures.
And do you want to offer any additional thoughts on the scope and conditions for contributions to be made in this sector by private sector financial technology companies? You've been through an experience of your own in this regard. Maybe you have some thoughts on that, and what may be needed in terms of federal policy, and what space stablecoin and other fintech companies might make in this regard.
Well, it's a bit what I said before about the federal government not having set. To have the chairman of the Fed say, as he has for a number of times, there's no federal regulatory framework. To have a presidential working group document says there's no federal regulatory framework. I don't want to sound. I want to say this. Well, so write one. That's your job, right? That to just comment that it's not there is not a good enough answer. That's obviously challenging, so I don't mean to be flippant about it. What we're left with then, and I'll go back to the original question. There's very little I want to say about Diem because we've sold the technology to a bank who's going to try to take it forward, except for a couple things. One is we were told by the Fed at one point, look, that's the best stablecoin design.
Diem.
But we don't want you to go forward anyway because we don't have a comprehensive federal regulatory framework in place to regulate you if you scale. Now, my view of that is, well, that's, I've done my job. I won't say the next sentence. But one of the things that we offer, that we try to do at Diem is get this balance between privacy and transparency. So we had essentially an intermediated system that used a blockchain where people were going to have to be KYC'd to use our payment system. Now, there may be other solutions to these problems besides the one that we came up with. And, there are thousands of smart people out there, and obviously they're smarter than I am because we didn't get it started. But there is a way for the private sector to contribute here and to help get this balance right in a way that serves not only the private sector's interests, but also, I believe, U.S. national security interests.
Mm-hmm. You want to add anything, Daryl?
I just want to add briefly to give a concrete example of what Stuart just said about the lack of a regulatory framework. Believe it or not, the United States does not have a federal regulatory framework for money transmission. You have bank deposits, which are regulated by banking regulators. You have securities, which are regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the SEC has indicated it kind of views cryptocurrencies as securities unless it's otherwise directed by Congress. And that means that if someone like Diem, for example, wants to conduct payments in the US economy, but not as a bank, Diem was done through a bank, but not as a bank, there is no regulatory framework. And that could be good or bad. If you're an entrepreneur, it could be good because nobody is holding you back in some sense. And there are stable coins provided in the United States with, I would say, a very weak regulatory framework at the current moment. But for those entering the market and hoping for a long-term, profitable, compliant future, they don't know what they have to comply with yet. And investors are not likely to put up a whole lot of money in order to enter a market whose rules are not yet clear.
Okay, let's take a couple questions. Yes, sir, on the side there.
Thank you for the session. I had a follow-up question. So when you think about CBDC in the international payment framework, I was actually curious on like how do you go about navigating the governance and the access rights to the financial data generated and the footprint of running with such currency, and kind of speaking a little bit more about the international regulatory framework that might be in place to help manage such thing.
Okay, I'll give it a shot. So first of all, I think responsible central banks are not, except for, they're not going to be giving out accounts to consumers and businesses all over the world, because if you imagine the dollar, if you think about, any of you live in Argentina, paper US dollars are a very convenient form of payment in Argentina. If a central bank digital currency, officially condoned, perfectly stable, regulatory, everything is good, were given out to anyone in the world that wanted to hold it, it would soon basically make it very difficult for many central banks around the world to control their monetary policy. Now, from a U.S. dollar dominance point of view, that would be a wonderful outcome. But it's not playing nice in the international arena, and I think the United States and other countries should not be promoting that. Now, that doesn't mean to say that CBDCs won't be used for cross-border payments, and there needs to be guidelines or, let's say, standards set for how does one CBDC talk to another, or how does a CBDC exchanged for fiat currency or bank deposits in another economy. We don't have any such international standards. That's one of the reasons that this takes up a lot of space in Chapter 5 of our report. We really think the United States should first have the technology available so that it can speak credibly and know what it's saying, know about what it's saying, and secondly, lead in the setting of those standards. Again, I would say that private digital currencies should be considered at the same time. That's a form of cross-border payment that could become just as important. I think it's actually one of the best use cases for stablecoins today, because the correspondent banking system for cross-border payments is extremely expensive and frustratingly slow. If you've ever, I'm sure many people have tried to send a payment to their auntie in Torino or some other country and found the incredible difficulty and expense of doing that. And stablecoins provide a very, very convenient way to do that. But again, we don't really have a regulatory framework, and someone needs to set that up. By the way, China is experimenting with one form of use of the ECNY in another currency zone, Hong Kong. You can, according to their plans, you will soon be able to use your ECNY digital wallet to pay for merchandise or dinner or a hotel in Hong Kong, and the merchant will receive the money in Hong Kong dollars through their fast payment system. So you could think of that as one modality for the use of a central bank digital currency in a different economy. And again, standards have not been set for how to do that.
Okay, you want to add anything, Stuart?
No.
Anything else that anyone, yes, over here?
Hi, thanks again for a great discussion. This is an important contribution. I'd be interested in hearing anybody's additional thoughts on how to sort of deal with that fundamental tension between what Stuart called transparency and privacy, or security and privacy. And in particular, it seems like the technology itself may offer part of the solution. In other words, one of the wonderful things about blockchain is it creates an audit trail. So if you're trying to watch the watchers, I wonder whether there's a way to use blockchain to see who's accessing, using, and retaining data that's supposed to be private, and whether any thought's been given to some technical approach there.
Very interesting. Stuart?
Yeah, I don't know. That strikes me as you're saying surveilling how people are monitoring the blockchain. That feels pretty complicated in a way, and maybe more intrusive than any privacy worry that we've got. But certainly, the theme of challenging, Zhiguo was talking about all these brilliant engineers working in this space, and we've all probably seen articles about how the best engineers are going off and working on crypto, and that's what's happening today. If we challenge that group of people and say, look, it's not just about preserving privacy, it's also about preserving transparency. Come up with a digital identity solution. I frankly think if the government set a rule that said, we're going to require a certain level of transparency for the private sector to get in there, the private sector will do it because it's not an insolvable problem, and it's the amount of, frankly, the amount of resources that the reward for being the winner in this space is astronomical in a private sector sense, which is why all these venture capital firms are raising billions of dollars to deploy. So I think that, challenging the private sector to say, look, you guys should try to solve this is the right way. I don't know what the answer is. Certainly, I'm not a technologist, as you know.
Daryl, we're at noon. Any final words or thoughts? No. Okay. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to invite you to take a copy of the report as you leave. I want to thank all 31 members of the working group who met patiently and volunteered quite a bit of their time over the course of an entire year to produce what I think is an extremely timely report that's a real public service to our national interest and our collective international interest in being able to make financial transactions in a way that serves our values of privacy, transparency, efficiency, and accountability. Most of all, I want to thank the person in the leadership who is here, Daryl Duffy, and the person in the leadership who is not here, Elizabeth Economy, for their extraordinary leadership of this project. Thank you all for coming.
Larry, thanks for inviting me.